Howdy, and welcome to the Growing the Next Version of You show. My name is Mike Rochelle. I'm a strategic influencer who collects meaningful relationships, actionable philosophies, and methods to help people and organizations refine their purpose for results growth. Every week, I chat with thought leaders as we explore leadership as a mind, body, and spirit, yes, an inside out experience that helps us grow and make the world a better place. Join me. Awesome. Well, I'm joined today by Brad Cope. Brad, thanks very much for coming out to Highland Village and joining me here.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, as I told you at the beginning, you're a brave fellow. You're my first guest on the show, so thank you very much for coming out. What we're going to do today is I'm going to introduce Brad, his bio and such. Then I'm going to ask him to provide a little more personal introduction. We're going to talk about several topics of interest that Brad and I have discussed in advance. And we're going to build into that the servant leadership model of mind, body, spirit, and talk about things from all of those perspectives as well. I'll introduce In My Shoes, where Brad is a board member. And then finally, we'll talk about how you can keep in touch with Brad and In My Shoes. So let's just get on to it. So Brad Cope helps companies get the word out. He's a marketing leader, strategic marketer, content creator. He likes digital. He is adept in healthcare and legal IT, information technology, and services. He helps get the word out as a creative and data-driven B2B, B2C, B2G marketer with a background in journalism. He's delivered double-digit annual growth in lead generation and brand awareness at startup to Fortune 500s, and here's how. If you want all of the details here, just go to his LinkedIn profile and you'll see more of it. But I picked a couple. Marketing strategy. He's increased sales by 49% and produced 35% of sales pipeline through multi-channel campaigns, brand positioning, and MarTech built at Verisys and Aperture Health. From a digital marketing perspective, he's raised key digital marketing metrics by 35% in 1 year with research-based mix of engaging advertising and content marketing at HMS. He completed a digital marketing and analytics executive program with this SMU, Southern Methodist University. He also focuses on product marketing and thought leadership, one of the reasons I asked him to come on today. In that, he's increased case studies by 25% and testimonial quotes by 167% at Medecision. He's a two-time winner of the International Association of Business Communicators Gold Quill and four-time Dallas-Fort Worth American Marketing Association Marketer of the Year. If you'd like to get in contact with Brad, you can do so on LinkedIn, and I'll provide some of the details on that at the end of the show today. One of the things that he's very passionate about, and I've had the pleasure, along with my wife, to go to the trivia night for In My Shoes, which is a 501c3 organization located in Dallas, Texas. The mission of In My Shoes is to provide a safe, welcoming community for pregnant women who are homeless or at the risk of homelessness. We empower women to learn and develop the life, job, and parenting skills necessary to live a healthy and complete life for the good of themselves and for their babies. And we provide the services, tools, and support to transform lives and families. They are looking for staff members, so if you know anybody that's in residential services, you can get a hold of love@liveinmyshoes.org for more information. One of the things that I was most impressed with, Brad, from the trivia night that we attended was the focus on the life cycle of somebody that's pregnant and needing of help, right? Very much like the educational services that are in the marketplace. There are a lot of others that focus on an individual point in time and really not the whole life cycle. So what I love about In My Shoes is they do more than just taking care of the person during the pregnancy. They actually provide space for them and life skill training and things like that for a good time after the pregnancy as well. So their programs include emergency housing, individual and group therapy, food and clothing assistance, parenting and life skills curriculum and presentations, community involvement, goal setting and reward program, and work and school support. So, Brad, you're a busy guy. What are the things that I get the opportunity to do as one of the board members of the Association for Business Technology Professionals, where we both serve, is to ask people to be on my board all the time. And the usual response is, "Well, I'm busy and I have other things going on." The one thing that I now know about you is how much involved you are within Her Shoes. And I think you're volunteering this afternoon. Matter of fact, that's why we moved our time forward. But not only are you a busy guy, but you're a thoughtful person. That's what I really appreciate about you. So that's kind of the background from a bio perspective. I think we met nearly 2 years ago, thanks to Robert Hunt and Chuck Vandewiel. And we met at a hamburger place. And at that point, you were looking for a role. And we talked about, how to approach the marketplace and things like that. I hope I was of some assistance. But the cool thing about those times of life is that you get to know somebody in a deep way very quickly. So that's been a pleasurable thing for me. You've also been active in the Association for Business Technology Professionals. And like I said, you're my first guest, the first one that not only said yes, but how soon can we meet? So I very much appreciate that. What I'd like to do now is just to ask you to provide a little bit of your background. As I said in the prep document, the speeds and feeds of your life. Who made you who, and why are you you?
Absolutely. And thank you for that introduction. That's really it's great to hear it summarized that way. And my recollection of our meeting is very similar.
Yeah.
And that you are very much a servant-minded person from the jump. And I think it's just a network that when you bring people who are like-minded together, and they really are looking to help the other person first. So that works in networking, that works as companies. So that's where that servant leader model comes from, and you live that out from the first time we met until now, of course.
Thank you.
So as far as how to get to know me better, aside from the things that we have already talked about, which has been mostly about career things, I think it's one fun way to look at it is our places. So if you wanted to get to know me, there are a few places that it's useful to know where I'm from or have been. And the first one is where I'm from initially, which is West Texas. Born and for the most part raised in Lubbock. And for people that aren't from there or haven't been there very much, I think of West Texas as the Sparta of the United States, meaning that they are natural stoics and very much take things as they come, and whatever it is dealt to you, you have to figure a way around it, over it, under it, through it. So the toughest people I know come from that area. And I think that it's useful in a lot of ways because, of course, you need determination and a sense of what you're willing to do to make things happen. And I think that it really is something that characterizes a lot of the things that I've done over the course of my life. Another stop on that journey, which is almost the opposite, is for a time I was a magazine editor in New York City for about 6 years. And there, in the United States, I can think of very few contrasts that are more pronounced than between West Texas and Manhattan. Very different in every way that I can think of, except for one. And I say this to everybody who has ever said anything negative about New York or anything negative about Texas, which are mostly Texans one way and New Yorkers the other way. The thing that I think really binds them together is that they think they're the best.
Hmm.
So to me, New Yorkers were very much easy to understand.
You
They
can
sounded
you
like the
can get
people I
along.
grew up with my whole life, where
Sure.
New York was great in everything, even things that it was obviously not great at.
Right.
And then Texas the same way. We think we're the best at everything. And
Yeah.
then if you point out some ways we're not, it's like, well, you're wrong.
Yeah.
So that it's that same kind of mentality. But great place, great people, and also exposure to different ideas, which I think was really
And
helpful.
that was 6 years in the city.
6 years there,
Wow.
and so that's impressive that you know to call it the city. Uh, when you're out there, you learn that it was well. There's the city, and then there's upstate New York.
Hmm.
That basically means everything that's not New York City.
Right.
And people that live around the city, you don't say New York City, you say the city. So
Yeah.
I learned that on the third day. So you're way ahead of me. So yeah, that was a great place. And then now living in Dallas, I would pick that. Been here for about 15 years. Really appreciate the culture here. One of the things we're going to get into, I think, is kind of the unique networking environment that and kind of a view of business that you'll find here more dramatically than other places. And my example of that would be this kind of servant leadership, more thoughtful. I've worked for a couple of companies down here that embody that. As a vendor to Southwest Airlines, very much all about the employee, all about the customer,
Sure.
and then at Interstate Batteries, also that same kind of mentality, but
You and
just
Chuck were there together, right?
exactly, which is one of the ways that we connected.
Yeah.
So I think those three stops are a pretty good way to get a peek into where I come from.
Okay. How about family and how you grew up, kind of things?
Sure. So for me, it was the best way to think about it is that I grew up in Texas, and then I went to Trinity University
Mm,
in San Antonio,
sure.
and great school. Really loved my time at Trinity. The best thing that happened to me there, though, was meeting my wife Susan.
Ah, very good.
And another good contrast is that she's from New Orleans. And if I were to pick another place that is as unlike West Texas as Manhattan, I might pick New Orleans.
The Big Easy.
Exactly. It's not Sparta.
Yeah.
I tell you that it's not. But I loved it, and I even developed a taste for the food, the music, because I was in love, and still am. So we married. Been married for almost 30 years now,
Wow.
and then when we had two kids, they're twins. They're 21 years old,
Ah,
boy girl twins. And so I can't tell you how often I hear after I say that, are they identical? And I say, no, you can't have identical boy girl twins.
right. It kind of breaks the whole model.
Exactly. So I'm glad you didn't say that. Yeah. So one goes to Baylor, which didn't you go to Baylor?
No, my son just graduated
That's
there.
it. I knew I saw some Baylor
Yeah.
around here. And it's my daughter, and my son goes to Texas A&M.
Very good. Awesome. So, because we're body, mind, and spirit, so you've kind of talked about the differences between New York and West Texas. Have you ever seen 1883, the show?
I haven't seen it.
It's a spinoff of the Kevin Costner show, and I can't and that show
Yellowstone.
Yellowstone, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's from the 1883 is the year when these families are driving their selves and their um, wagons through Texas in order to get up to Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they're and the difficulty of the land and all that. It's a little overly dramatic, but it's a very powerful show. And in that part of Texas, West Texas, is fairly inhospitable, right?
Yes.
Water is scarce. It's not real um, helpful for people. So you probably would have to build that stoicism there.
Mm-hmm.
What about faith? What did you grow up in faith? What was that path like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was always sent to church, and went to the Baptist church.
Mm.
Um, there are about 500 Baptist churches in Lubbock, and I
Uh-huh.
went to one of them. And it was kind of different flavors of Baptists there, and I was one of the main flavors.
Mhm.
Um, Really helped me. Encouraged me all the ways that you would expect the faith life would do. Where my faith really took off, though, was at Trinity in San Antonio, where I got connected with a parachurch organization called the Navigators.
Ah, yeah.
And the Navigators are a ministry that it's not attached to a specific church.
Right.
It's they work with all different churches, all different people in different environments. One of them being college.
Sure.
And but it was great. It was what I'd missed it all those years growing up was this very practical way of looking at the faith.
Mhm.
So you would think, for instance, that someone growing up would have said, "Well, hey, well, let's pray together." Um, and I'm sure we did at times, but no one showed me how to pray.
Mm.
And of course, there are ways that go back centuries
Right.
that you can learn to pray, and then you have a well-rounded view of things because of that you follow a certain method. So things like that, and then ever since then, they still a very big part of my life. And of course, I'd like to make it as large as possible.
Sure.
Um, the one thing that has changed is that I'm not Baptist anymore. I'm Presbyterian,
Okay.
which puts me at odds with some of my Baptist friends. And just in a theological thing. Another thing, I love theology and I love philosophy. And one of the things that you find out pretty quickly is in the Christian church, we're all Christians,
Yeah.
but there are these different angles on it. And certain angles appeal to me because I saw them in Scripture,
Sure.
and that's why I'm reformed, is what they would call it these days, because I saw some things that I wasn't seeing picked up so well in some of these other places where I was,
Yeah.
that are definitely more pronounced where I am now.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been attending non-denominational churches since we moved to Dallas 21 years ago. And I think that, I think it's Bruce McLaren is the name of the author. I can't think of the name of the book right now, but he wrote a book where he talked about the 7 different churches that he's been a part of and how he learned something unique from each one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the way that I think
Yep.
about practices. And we'll talk about this later. I think the virtues thing. I think that's a way to talk about things without getting into all of the differences,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because everybody believes in love, everybody believes in joy, everybody believes in taking care of other people.
Yep.
And this goes well beyond the Christian faith, right? A lot of Hindu friends that I have, Sikhs, Jains, Muslim, they have the same desires and needs. So it opens up a way to have conversations. And I think there are more things that we have in common across all faith groups than we have differences. And if we focus on that instead of the differences, there's a lesson for that in our culture too, right? Especially with all the division and the mess that's going on right now.
Sure.
So, well, thanks for sharing that. One of the things that we were talking about earlier was this whole idea of leadership and the way that you look at it. So, what is your leadership philosophy? How do you think about it? Is servant leadership the way, or are there nuances to it? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, that's a big topic.
Yes.
So I'll just take that piece of it. I think, and maybe that goes back to what you were saying earlier about the different faiths. I think there are different ways to look at leadership, and that you can take elements of those and kind of construct your own model that works for you.
Right.
Um, One of the things I think is a good way to look at it is that every leader obviously is not the same. Every person that they're trying to lead is not the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, especially when you're young, at least when I was younger, I kind of thought of, if you're a boss, you're this kind of boss, full stop. Where a more and there's a virtue that we can talk about, the classical virtue of wisdom. What wisdom is about adapting to the situation um, in a way that leads to good results. And that means that the way I would work with you if you were my boss will be different than the way that I would work with another person who's my boss.
Mm-hmm.
Where I think things can break down is if you only have one model. You know,
Yeah.
say servant leader was your only model.
Right.
Um, how could that go wrong? It could go wrong in that it might lead you to not consider options that are more appropriate to your situation.
Mm.
And one example, which I've heard some people mention, is that say you're in a really toxic environment, and that you're the servant leader, but there's only so much that you can do to change a culture if it's toxic.
Mm-hmm.
There's a famous quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yep, that's a great one.
And that is true. So uh, if you're in a toxic culture and you have a servant leader mentality, you might hang on too long to try to change it,
Right.
to try to make things right, because you should. I mean, that's what a servant leader would do.
Right.
But wisdom should intervene there and say, no, wait a minute. Am I going to be able to really change this? This might not be the right place for me. So I think you need to have a holistic view of these things.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there are a couple of personalities that come to mind as as servant leaders. One that lived before we were born, but is still, at least in our cultural realm of understanding, was Gandhi. And Gandhi was somebody who, I think he was Hindu, but he actually practiced a lot of things from other religions as well. He was well versed in other ways, and really tried to meet people where they were. Um, so his mantra, which was "Be the change that you want to see in the world," right? He was nonviolent, which I think he picked up from Tolstoy and some others who he was in conversation with, and at the time when he was still in India and developing his methodologies. But it was very powerful because it was principle based. He was being a servant leader by disobeying certain laws, even, right, and doing things that upset the balance of power, like the salt thing, right, where they made their own salt instead of buying salt. Well, they kind of broke the business model for the salt sellers, and eventually broke the nation from the stranglehold that the British had on it.
Right.
And then the other example that I have from a servant leadership perspective is Jesus. He was not a wallflower, right? When it came time to talk about things that were wrong, he was pretty vicious with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you read any of the words that he gave to them about whitened sepulchres and snakes and other bad things, so he called a spade a spade. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be passive, is what I'm getting at.
Right.
And the longer that I live in life, and the more organizations that I've worked with, as you're looking at cultural change, some of the breakage needs to happen faster at the beginning, especially if you can identify where that cultural problem is coming from, who the individuals are that are providing it. And if it's coming from the top, then you are going to have to get out of that organization. I mean, you and I have experienced that multiple times in our careers. So, yeah, interesting. So, one of the things that we also talked about was personality assessments. I think you have an experience with a new one. You want to talk about cultural index and how you're coming to it, and maybe
Sure.
juxtapose it with a couple of others that you used.
Well, right. And so what's becoming a theme of this conversation is uh, trying to modify your approach based on the situation you see at hand. And I think one of the best tools I ever had along those lines was a personality assessment.
Yeah.
I was first introduced to Myers-Briggs back in as right out of college
Mm-hmm.
by a friend of mine who loved it. and we went through it with a cohort of friends.
Yeah.
And what was great about that was it was just a way of saying, because I think everybody, especially when you're younger, you think, well, the way I do things is the way. Does the toilet paper go over the top or does it go under? Now we know it goes over the top,
Right. Of course.
but
That's the only
some
way.
people have it go under for some reason, and it's not a right or wrong thing. And people's personalities are the same way. Um, People will drive you crazy, and you'll think, if, for instance, I have a friend. If you go to um, say you're going to a fast food restaurant, well, look at that board of options like it's a life decision of ultimate importance,
Yeah.
and just really puzzle over it. What's it going to be? Is it going to be the number 2 meal, the number 3 meal, or whatever? When I look at it, I think I just immediately know I'm going to pick this thing, and then I'll stand around for about 90 seconds or 2 minutes while this other person is really thinking it over. Well, because of these assessments, I think you get a sense of no, that I have strengths in a certain way that, and I have weaknesses, and those are often mirrored or supported by the other people's strengths and other
Right.
people's weaknesses.
Right.
So to get to your immediate question, an assessment that I've been connected to, relatively recently through the company where I work is called the Cultural Index. And so the idea behind the index is that, like Myers-Briggs, it's got some personality related pieces to it. And so things that you would expect, like, are you logical? Are you driven? And these are things that you'll see in Myers-Briggs and say the DISC assessment, which
Right.
many people use for work. Um, One part that I think is really interesting about it is that they've got an innovation piece of it, where it's on a sliding scale where it would be from, say, 0 to 10. And then based on the answers to your questions, you're saying, I see myself, or other people see me, as someone who's coming up with lots of ideas all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And what's great about that, and how we already use this on our team, is that we look for people that complement each other's strengths.
Right.
So if you've got a bunch of people that are innovators, it's a little, I think it's a purple dot. I'm not quite sure how they show it on the index,
Right.
but if you've got a lot of people there, well, then it's just an idea fest. It's like
No
brainstorming
executors.
24/7.
Nobody to get
Right.
stuff done.
But then you need some people that are further on down the scale to say, okay, now wait a minute. We can't do all these ideas. They're probably not all good ideas, but let's agree on the ones that really do work. One of the things that's kind of interesting, the way I see this company using it, is even with hiring. Um, Before we even go to hire somebody, the managers will say, okay, I need, for instance, a marketing manager. Here's the things I already know that what I want them to do. So with that in mind, I'm going to fill out a culture assess or index for that role, and up pops a certain kind of configuration.
Right.
And then we write the job description in a way that that's the first part. It's kind of like, Mike, you're an idea guy. You know how you introduce yourself, and then kind of this is the kind of person that's going to connect with this role.
Right.
And that's before you even get to responsibilities. You're going to be doing campaigns or whatever.
Right.
It's a certain kind of person, and so that I haven't seen done so much. And then even as part of the process, it's if someone gets pretty far along, we give them the index, and those two things should line up pretty well. What's the right thing in in isolation of a person, but then when the person comes along, do these things, are they at least pretty similar? Not perfect, but you wouldn't want to see something that's just wildly crazy that doesn't gel with what you think that this role means. And that I've seen to be a pretty original way of using some of this that I've seen to be pretty successful.
Yeah. So I've heard of the cultural index. I've not used it myself. My background in personality profile started in undergrad. So probably in 81, no, not 81, it'd been 87, 88. There was a professor in my undergraduate that gave a friend of mine a test. It was based on Hippocrates' work from 1,000 years before Christ. So is Myers-Briggs. So is DISC. So are about 30 other animals, colors, all those things. They're based on his original work.
Sanguine and
Yeah,
phlegmatic
yeah,
and
yeah.
those four.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't run into somebody that knows those terms, but it was all based on bodily fluids.
Right.
That's the way he looked at it, right? So that's how Myers-Briggs started. They broke it down into 16 different differences, and um, but what I found in doing it, I enjoyed it because I like to know a lot about people, right? But what I find with those kinds of tests is they're not very actionable. There's not a lot to do. So when I joined Microsoft in 2006, one of my boss's first thing was to ask me to take the Gallup strengths,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a lot different, right? It's much more in depth, 32 personality types. And like you said, it is the best use from my perspective is not only knowing what you're good at, but knowing how to partner with other people.
Mm-hmm.
And the class that you and I participated in together at Andy Ivy's shop back to last November, that'll actually be coming out on my Thinkific site pretty soon, where I'm breaking down those experiences. And the way that I teach it now is more how do you present yourself as a value to the other person,
Mm-hmm.
and then how do you or enable them to provide value into the relationship from their personality strengths perspective. So, and as you've experienced, that strength based conversation is a very powerful starting point,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then there are other things that you have to add to it to make it a more actionable, as I call it, pragmatic use of those tools.
Right. Well,
So
I've got to ask though. So with you and the Strengths Finder,
yeah,
they give you these top ones that apply to you. So what's your number one?
so connectedness is my number one.
Mm-hmm.
That's my French side. My dad, Rochelle, is French. It means little rock. And then the second one is maximizer, which is my Germanic side. My mother's German. I'm wearing my German, or have my German
Oh, there you go.
cup today. And then input, ideation, and belief.
Mm-hmm.
So the input is learning from people like you and learning from my sons and the things that they're doing, and my daughter and my wife and everybody that I know. So I'm curious, right?
Yes.
And for me, the input it's enough to know somebody that knows, because I can always ask them.
Mm-hmm.
We're learner. My wife is learner, has learner in her top five. They need to be able to double, triple, quadruple click down into the topic because they want to know,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are some topics that I'm like that, but not always. And the belief is just that I have to believe in what I'm doing, or I can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's at some level it can be a flaw too, right?
Right.
Because any of these things taken to the too far.
Sure.
So Gallup talks about balcony behaviors in your strength and basement behaviors in your strength.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times people are shocked to find out that somebody has a strength because they look at it as a weakness because that person is overdoing it.
Right.
Right. And then likewise, you have things that are behind you, things that you don't understand, your bottom strengths, as Gallup calls them, lesser strengths. They don't call anything weakness. The lesser strengths are things that can get you into trouble. So then you just have to moderate and utilize those things. Either use your strengths to cover it up, or, as I like to teach, partner with somebody that has that strength,
Mm-hmm.
and then enable them to do that part of whatever the task is.
Right.
Because as we in modern society get more and more specialized, then we need to be able to figure out how to engage other people and other personalities, other talents, other capabilities in a more fluid way.
Right.
And that's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've come across. You mentioned several of these sorts of things. One that I've heard, it's probably been now about 4 or 5 years, that is pretty popular, is the Enneagram.
Yeah.
So that is where there are these. I think there are 9
Yeah.
different approaches, and then one of the things that's interesting about that one is that it does the Strengths Finder thing, where it will say it's almost like you could be a number whatever,
Right.
5, but if you're a healthy 5, you do these certain things.
Right.
But if you're an unhealthy 5, then you're going to have these things,
Yeah.
which are not good. And
Yeah.
then Carl Jung, who's Sigmund Freud's
Yep.
frenemy,
Right.
he had archetypes,
Right.
and things like the hero, the outlaw, and then his point was, well, a lot of us sort of embody these, unconsciously. That's why they're archetypes.
Right.
And he called this bad part the shadow.
Right.
So if you're a hero and you have a shadow, well, then your shadow is that you're ruthless. You might become very unheroic
Yeah.
in some of the things that you do. So it's almost like there's a kernel of truth to all these things, because they keep coming and saying some of the same things
Yeah.
in
Definitely.
different ways.
So have you done the Enneagram?
Kind of not any kind of focused way, but sort of on the fly. They always say, I've heard this, is that you're never supposed to tell someone what their number is. That's considered dirty pool. Only you can say I'm a whatever, because
Because you're
then
not.
when you find out what the number means, that's not me. And
Right. Right.
right. But yeah, so you can take these assessments or read books,
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
So a good friend of mine who went to Gallup Strengths Week training with me together, and as my co-facilitator for the leadership forum that I do at the society, or at the Association for Business Technology Professionals, Mike Shaw, um, kept telling me about the Enneagram. So I did it. So I'm an 8, which is a controller.
Yes.
And then, but the thing that the Enneagram does that nothing else that I've ever seen does is it gives you the wings, which are when you're happy, where do you go? And when you're stressed, where do you go?
Right.
And I think that's a really powerful thing. And that's the shadow part, right? Because when you're happy, you're usually on your best behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It's the thing that you're doing. But when you're stressed and not happy, where do you go? And then that tells you how to deal with that. And it's pretty spot on.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have it in front of me, so I don't remember what the names of the different things are, but the principles are great. And I think it actually, in the research that I've done, it started it like in the 6th century.
Right.
And it was Muslim scholars that started it. I don't know.
Well, the thing that I think is, and I've heard, who knows, because I'm not the historian of the Enneagram,
Yeah.
but one of the things that it's kind of funny, the difference between the 6th century and today, because we were laughing earlier about with Gallup,
Right.
It's a strength and it's a not so strength. It's very politically correct the way they talk about weaknesses.
Right.
But the Enneagram, the way I was introduced to it is, and I think this may be the only one that does it this way, is the foundation of it is a particular kind of sin that you're more likely to fall into.
Yeah.
It'd be things like fear.
Right.
That's your besetting sin, and then or pride or something.
Right.
But these days, in the 21st century, nobody talks about that.
Well, I mean, so you notice that, so I have my pyramid on my methodology. It starts with you, and then you have virtues and what it is that you are, um, what your purpose is, the virtues and strengths, right? So the reason that I do that is because even though I live in this century, there is wisdom in those old ways that really has created the beautiful society that we have, right? Because it's based on virtue, right? And the reason to use virtue instead of values goes to what is the opposite, which is vice, right? So if for those of you who are not familiar with the whole conversation, you may, and I don't even know if they call them this anymore, but all of the known sins that police had to deal with, they created a department called the Vice Squad. So if you had a virtue, that was a good thing, and there was no policing of that because it's good and it's good for society. But there are certain things in society that are vices, and so they had a vice squad. So prostitution.
It was at least through the 80s because we had Miami Vice.
Yeah, there you go.
So we know it was fine until then.
So anyway, that was interesting. So that whole language, so that you're into philosophy is interesting too. I didn't know that. It was Nietzsche in the 1880s that started changing the conversation from virtue to value.
Mhm.
And one of the reasons to do it now, Daniel, oh boy, I'm losing his last name right now. He was on the board for a couple of years. He was actually a philosophy major in school, and he gave me a different perspective on Nietzsche, and I've checked up on it, and it's actually he's not, he's the one that said God is dead.
Mhm.
That's the famous quote, but the famous quote was, "We have killed God
Right.
through our philosophy."
Mhm.
It wasn't that he was actually dead, but he said it was a problem. If God is dead, then how do we run our lives,
Mhm.
right? It
Yep.
was not a, I don't know exactly what he believed, but I'm softened on that perspective. But there was a gal who wrote a book about Victorian England. Um, and that's where I found out that he was the one that was actively trying to change virtue to value.
Mhm.
And the reason being is that each individual can value different things on a different scale,
Right.
right? So the thing that I like about virtue and virtue ethics
Mhm.
and the whole path of virtue ethics, not only because it's the Rosetta Stone for the faith, but also because throughout the ages, wise people have decided that these are the things that make you happy in life and that give you a good life. And these are the things that lead you down a road that does not make you happy and does not provide value to society. So it's really just a pragmatic way of deciding what are the behaviors that we should be doing as human beings and which are those that we shouldn't.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a to me it's a really interesting topic. And the reason why I think it is because to pick up on one thread of what you're saying is that it's a concept that's open to everyone. That you don't have to come from a certain philosophical position or faith tradition to be able to
Right.
understand how this
Yeah.
begins. So you take so Aristotle's a classic example in ethics. He says his project in ethics is how do we become happy?
Right.
And he starts there, and then as he goes along through many pages of how he teases out these virtues, he's identifying the way you get to happiness. And he's not quoting a book of the Bible. He's not looking at some
Didn't
reference
exist
to a
yet.
previous authority like Socrates.
Right.
He's just saying, think about it. What we want to be is happy, right? And people, okay, yeah, I want to be happy. But then from there, you wind up taking some interesting turns
Yeah.
because of what you find out.
Yeah, definitely. Well, remember in the experience that we had in November, we talked about Hawkins' chart of consciousness, and I think there's a lot of connection between the virtue ethics and the levels of consciousness that Hawkins talks about. Um, the chart of ethics starts at, oh, what is the bottom? I can't remember. I have it on my phone, so let me grab that. It actually comes up. So shame starts at 20 points. Then it goes to guilt, apathy, grief, fear. Let's see if I can get rid of all my mentions here. Yeah, anger, desire, anger, pride, and those are all negative. So if you're living in that sphere of life, then you're a drag on society. But as you get into courage, neutrality, willingness, acceptance, and reason was the thing that Socrates and Aristotle and all those guys were primarily, those are very positive, right? Courage starts at 200. Reason is already up at the 300 level. Love is 400. Joy is 500. Peace is 600. Enlightenment is 700.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if you're trying to keep your who you are, yourself, and your being aligned with certain thought patterns, you're going to be more positive and more productive in society. So it's an interesting connection, I think.
And I'll pick up on a piece of that I think is fascinating, and then so hopefully viewers are also interested in this. and this is kind of, to me, this is really interesting because it's, some people will hear, oh, a lot of this show is about philosophy, and I'll say, I don't want to hear about that. But the kind of philosophy that we're talking about is out of fashion in academia, but
Right.
extremely pragmatic,
Right.
which is, you were talking about your thought patterns. Um, what's the mental tape that goes through your head such
Right.
that is conducive to virtue?
Yeah.
And that's not like saying how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that you can use all the time.
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, Paul, my son, is our producer of the show. Paul, do you remember what Mrs. Jackson would say about your thoughts become your actions?
Watch your thoughts, thoughts become your actions. Watch your actions, they become your life. Watch your life, they become your destiny, or something like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's
So
just a cycle going on and on that it takes over more.
yeah. So what he said is that Betty Jackson, who I think is second grade teacher, third grade teacher, she's retired now, but she's a beautiful lady. She's still in the neighborhood and came to his graduation party and is just really a great part of our cultural life here in Highland Village. She taught all three of our children through third grade and remains a great person. But anyway, because she did this so many times, we get to hear it multiple times. What's your thoughts? They become your actions. What your actions? They become your habits. What's your habits? They become your destiny. Mm-hmm. Something like that.
Right.
It's a well-known thing, but she taught it to our kids, and for which I'm eternally grateful to her. But it was a powerful way of thinking, because Richard Porter, another guy that I follow, he has a guided meditation show. He talks about your thoughts become reality, right? So what you have to think about what you're thinking about, because if you're thinking about positive things and growth, then that's going to be what your life is about. If you're thinking of negative things, and things that are not good, then that's what your life is going to become too.
And I heard an interesting point of view about this particular piece, which was the idea that with your thoughts, that if you did an inventory of your thoughts and were to say you're to categorize them as positive or negative, like Mike is saying,
Yeah.
What would be the percentage of positive, negative? And the basic read was, well, that most of us, it would be 80, 90% negative.
Yeah.
And then the feedback was, well, if that's the case, your worst employee, you would never have 80 or 90% negative communication all the time.
Right.
So why are you treating yourself like someone worse than you've ever worked with?
Right.
It doesn't make sense. It's not conducive to a good life.
Yeah. Yeah. So the interesting thing too is that all of these things that are coming out in modern psychology, where they're studying and documenting how things flow, because Porter is a psychologist. That's his profession, right? Um, they often align very, very well with wisdom literature, right? So there's a scripture that says, um, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things of good report, and there are other things, think on these things. Well, the fathers of the faith knew that what you think is what you become, mm-hmm. and the actions that you are. Right. So, it's a very powerful thing.
And even just to go down that train a little bit further, it's always funny to me when you were talking about how people think of Jesus as this kind of milquetoast character.
Right.
And he's not. And or they'll say, I love the Sermon on the Mount. And then, the question is, well, have you ever read the Sermon on the Mount? Because it is one of the most hardcore, difficult things that you could ever be exposed to.
Right.
And it's difficult in this way. So Jesus will say, you've heard it said, do not murder, but I tell you not to be angry.
Right.
At anyone.
Because you've already committed murder in your mind.
Right. And then, so a wisdom principle that you can extract from that is that where does murder begin? Mm-hmm. It begins with anger. I mean, you just don't see somebody and then, okay, I'm going to off that person.
Right.
You're motivated by this. So if you tend it, if you curate it like a fire,
Right.
well, then you're playing with fire.
Right.
And then, who knows, you may not murder the person,
Right.
but you can destroy relationships
Right.
and hurt yourself.
Very good. So the next thing from a methodology perspective, from a philosophy perspective, is if you know what your core virtues are, and you know what your purpose is, and you know what you're good at, then that will fuel you to do great work, right? And so then the next thing is to align that with your own goals and the organization that you're working for's goals. As a leader, it's to identify what your dreams are, what my dreams are, so that you can help that person align those purpose and virtues and strength in the job that they have, and show them how it's building them to the next person that they want to be, right? So that's very powerful. The next thing is, so we in the course that you and I did together, we talk about strength-based conversations, because those are easy, right? Whenever there's not a difficult thing, when it's an assignment and you're just trying to get together and work together. But eventually you're going to get to things where you disagree, and there are hard things that are going to perhaps either make or break a company or make or break your job or those kinds of things. So then you have crucial conversations, which are more difficult, and there are bigger consequences.
Right.
So then Crucial Conversations is a great book written by 4 psychologists that came out of the Covey organization. And it's a powerful book to understand how to have those conversations. But in my methodology, if you've already created a relationship where you know what somebody's good at, you know what gives them energy, because doing the things that we're good at really gives us energy, right?
Right.
Then you can elicit that into the difficult conversation and have a higher than average possibility of getting through that unscathed and successful.
Well, this is one thing worth dwelling on for a second.
Yeah.
'Cause I think a lot of us have heard that notion that, say you want to you have a crucial conversation, it's going to be negative. That I've heard it called the sandwich strategy or the Oreo strategy. And the basic idea is that you'll start off with something good.
Right.
And then you say something bad.
Right.
And then you wind up with something good. So you
Right.
kind of soften the blow
Right.
by cushioning it on the front and the back end.
Right.
What's something else? That's the one I know the best. But what's something else that's a technique that would be useful for somebody that's entering a difficult conversation?
So let's use a cultural example, right? Let's say that we're in a conversation with somebody who's in a different place than we are on a topic. Let's talk about, I don't know, you name a topic, something that's in the culture that is difficult right now. Can you think of one?
Think of something? Let's see. Politics is always a divisive thing.
So let's say you are a liberal and your compatriot that you're talking to is a conservative, right? So what Crucial Conversations would say is that there has to be created in the middle between you and that other person a pool of shared meaning. And that pool of shared meaning needs to be based on facts, not on emotion, not on desire, but on facts, right? So what the path forward in that difficult conversation would be for you to provide your facts, and then for them to provide their facts into the pool of shared meaning. And then once you have an understanding, and this is the difficult part, it's to understand where they're coming from, right? As a liberal, I might have a particular position on whatever the topic that I'm having, and I will provide my facts. And then they, as a conservative, would have their facts that maybe are not aligned with my facts. So then we have to have a conversation on which of the facts we're going to use to make the decision to move forward together. Right? That is the model that they provide, and I think it's an excellent model because it it handles any situation that you can come up with.
Now, is the pool of shared meaning, is that the notion? I've seen this. This may or may not be what they're advocating,
Mm.
but what I've seen some people would do in a situation like that is they would say, okay, look, uh, here's what we both want. We both want the United States to be as strong as possible.
Yep.
And everybody should be nodding to that.
Right.
Right. So there, that could be your context for which you feed in the facts.
Right.
Or is it just, it's not like there's any umbrella term for the context. You just feed in the facts.
Well, I mean, so we're skirting around a hypothetical, right?
Mm-hmm.
The actual conversation would likely be that you are on a board together and you're trying to get to an agreement on how you're going to move forward on a decision,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it needs to pertain to whatever that topic is, and to move forward together. Because the next step after you have a pool of shared meaning, you understand what they're saying and can repeat it to them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the key, right? Because what's happening culturally right now, both in politics and in the culture, is that we're not listening to each other.
Mm-hmm.
We can't listen to each other because we're not willing to listen to the facts that the other person has. So you have to, not only do you have to let them put their fact in the pool of shared meaning, but you have to understand it well enough to articulate it back to them.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of techniques. There are probably too many in the book that they talk about how to use them, right? But then the end in mind is that you then create a plan from which you're going to move forward together. Mm-hmm. And do something together. The other thing that you have to take into consideration is how much do you trust the other person, right? Mm-hmm. And that's another conversation for another time. But even if you have a low trust environment, if you are careful with how you construct the pool of shared meaning and you're careful with how you create the plan to move forward together on whatever the action is that you need to do, then you have a higher than average percentage of possibility for success.
You know, and I don't know how long you want to stay on this, but we could keep riffing on this the entire time.
Let's go.
There's an interesting concept along these lines. There's a sociologist, and I can't remember where he is from, but his name's Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, and he's written a number of books. And one of the books, I think he co-wrote what I'm about to talk about, mm-hmm. are these. So we're talking about creating this, shared culture.
Right.
And what he did is he interviewed conservatives, liberals, and then what he was trying to do was get down to what we would call values, mm-hmm. or possibly virtues. Depends on how you look at it. Sure. But what he found was there are basically 7 options, thereabouts, that people can draw on that they think are right or wrong, that animate them, that help them make decisions. And what he found, so an example would be there's a care is one, that we should take care of people, mm-hmm. right? So he's got about, I think, 7 of these. But what he found is that when he would interview these different people from different political perspectives, that they didn't have, they had some overlap with these, but then some, there's like a Venn diagram.
Sure.
Some of them had, the liberals had these, and they had this overlap, and then the conservatives had these. And that leads to a lot of problems, because if you're not drawing from the same well of shared value, then there's an issue. And I think care is an overlap, but don't quote me on this.
Sure.
But one I know that's not is that conservatives have this value. We would call, I think it's something like, he says it as sanctity, or holiness, or the idea of evil, that kind of notion. And so when conservatives look at an issue, that's a well of value that they're pulling from, that if they try to be persuasive from that well of value,
right,
to a liberal, it's like, well, that's not important to me. So if you kind of keep that in mind, you can kind of say, well, okay, if I'm talking to a conservative, well, maybe I'll pull from that. But let's look at the ones that there's more of an overlap, because that is a truly shared part.
Right.
And I think care is a good one, is that liberals care about caring, and then conservatives do too. They just disagree about what's the most caring approach.
Yeah.
Right.
and the policies
Yeah,
and what comes out of that.
exactly.
Yeah. So I think there's something to some of the possibility going back several thousand years ago. In the virtue ethics conversation, they came up with a concept called the virtue or the golden mean,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
So if you think of a distribution of society, one of the things to take into consideration, and I get comfort from this,
Mm-hmm.
because in the midst of all of this rancor and problems that we're having, what it basically says is that as long as you're staying within a one or two standard deviations, then you're still fairly centered,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, I don't know if you saw, who was it that posted this? Oh, it was Elon Musk posted the mean, and he showed how at this point, from his perspective, and I think it was somebody else that wrote it, but he was just
Yep. Quoting it.
uh, shooting it out, that the liberals were trying to move the mean over to the left
Mm-hmm.
by being extremely extreme,
Sure.
right? And so, and I think there's some validity to the way that the diagram is written,
Mm-hmm.
right? But so that's why that old adage, if you give an inch, you give a yard.
Yeah.
You've got to be careful with where you are able to move. But if you look at politics, and the way that I think about this is, if you look at the last, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, even with all of the escalation that have been happening, and the right is as um, to blame for this as the left. So I'm not saying anybody necessarily is better than anybody else. What I'm saying is that in the mean, we still have 50% of the population that is liberal and 50% of the population that is conservative,
Mm-hmm.
by and large, right?
Right.
And that keeps the system that our forefathers in the nation created intact,
Mm-hmm.
because at some level the rancor um, actually assists in keeping the mean where it needs to be,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you can't let one party or one thought process rule the others. So the danger that I do see, though, in the society today is that if one group says you can't talk because this is the ultimate truth and there is no other truth,
Mm-hmm.
that's a problem,
Right.
right? And I think history would show that that's a problem as well.
Right. Right. And yeah, and that's a good point too. And what I want to go back to though is the concept of what is, and this is where you started with Elon Musk, is this
Yeah,
concept of what is allowed in society to talk about.
right,
And I don't know if he was referencing this, but there's this concept of the Overton window. And the idea behind the Overton window is that depending on what you talk about, the more you push it, the further along that you can take the conversation. And it you may not get everything you want, but you'll be
right,
pushing in a direction you want. And I think you're absolutely right in that everybody does this. And
sure,
uh, to me, the examples are almost comical because if you're at all centrist in your political views, you can see. Hopefully, these two examples will sound comical to you, but I'll use one from each side. So, and so I'll start off with Donald Trump because I think he understood more than any conservative politician the concept of the Overton window,
right,
because he would say the most absurd things. But what I think a lot of people didn't get is that all he was trying to do is to move the conversation over. He didn't think he was actually going to get this. And so my favorite one of his like this is, I'm going to build a great big wall
right,
and I'm going to make Mexico pay for it.
yeah,
Now that's out there. Mexico is going to pay for the wall. But really, all he was trying to do was to move the discussion on immigration in his direction.
right,
An example, going the other way, sticking with immigration, why not? So you'll hear liberals say, we're basically going to have an open border, and then these people are going to be able to vote like U.S. citizens, and that's actually happening. And
right,
but most centrists say we don't want non-citizens to vote. It sounds absurd. Why would you allow that? Only Americans should be able to vote. But both sides are trying to use this technique
Right.
they're not going to get everything, but they're just trying to move the discussion their direction.
Yeah. That I agree with that. The problem is that there are people involved in that whole conundrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think I saw something the other day, like 4,000 people have died trying to get across the river in the last 3 or 4 years. So there are unfortunate realities with both of those positions that are untenable.
Mm-hmm.
So then we can't get reasonable things done
Mm-hmm.
because it's so polarized
right.
in the way we think about it. So
sure.
So my desire would be that we stop polarizing things and become more focused on actually getting things done,
mm-hmm.
right? And that was the whole idea behind the centrist movement many years ago. And I think there are more and more people that are desiring that too, right? Yeah, interesting. So from a the other topic that we were going to talk about was paradox.
Mm-hmm.
So before you get into paradox, can you talk a little bit about your time in New York and your magazine
mm-hmm.
Editorial experience?
Sure.
Do you mind sharing what the magazine was, or
not at all. So the magazine where I work the most in New York is a news magazine called The Week, which is imported from Great Britain. It's a news digest, meaning that it takes from all of these different sources of news, shrinks it down so that it's very bite-sized, and reorients it to do some of what we're talking about. So they'll take a difficult issue like immigration, like I just did, and it'll give the news, but then it'll say, this is from a conservative point of view, like the American Greatness
they'll give
website.
both sides of the
right?
conversation,
And they'll just summarize a whole column in a paragraph, and then it'll be, well, what does the New York Times say about it? A liberal perspective, their editorial page, and so it makes them talk to each other, so that when you get to the end of it, you can say, well, I'm going to decide for myself what I think
pros and cons
makes sense. And this goes back to what you're saying earlier, I think, which is that if you can think your way to where you can describe the other position as well as they can, well, then you're a long way there.
Right.
Because it's kind of like you not only think it through, but you can feel it through.
Right.
And one of the great things about working in New York was that after working there a little while, I could hear a bit of news and I could think about it, with this perspective. I know what a conservative would say about this.
Sure.
I know what a liberal would say about this, and I even know why they would say it. And so it's ever since then, politics has now become to me more like a soap opera. In a sense, it's a story I picked up really paying attention to around 2000. But now I'm kind of into it because, once you tune in to As the World Turns, it's hard to pull out and say, well, I don't want to watch that show anymore. But the characters are their characters. They have a point of view, and they operate in a way that makes sense if you have that point of view. And that was
worldview.
Right. And that was really helpful. Where I think we want to go is that so that's useful, I think, just in everyday life. But something that I picked up along those lines, around that time, that from a perspective of communication that is really valuable, because all of us are trying to communicate in a way that magazines like I used to write for, or websites, they're trying to get people to pay attention. There's so much noise, so hard to break through.
Right.
All of us. So an example would be you send out an email. Well, your boss might get 100 emails a day, but you're trying to get his attention. Or for a marketer like me, I'll send out an email for my company, but then the prospect might be getting 200 emails a day. Well, how is mine going to stand out? And something that a technique that we used in the magazine world that I found to apply pretty much across the board is this concept of paradox. And so paradox is something that really does make sense, but when you first hear it, it doesn't make sense. And so an example would be, when is a door not a door? Well, when it's ajar, right? Right. So it's a joke that gets to paradox. An example, one of the biggest news stories of all time is the Titanic, because the Titanic is the unsinkable ship that sank.
Right.
So the way that you can make this work for you, that I found, is when you're dealing with an issue or trying to be persuasive, if you can find an element of it that would appear not to make sense, but does, if you start with that, well, then you hook the reader. And then they'll say, well, that's really interesting, Mike. You think this, and then tell me more. And then you've got them. Once you've hooked them, that's it's not even half of it. It's more than half of the challenge. And then they're into your material and you can make your point. And so that, I think, is a really useful thing that pretty much everybody can do. It could be as easy as writing a subject line on your email, or how you start one, or how you start a conversation, or if you're ever speaking somewhere, the first thing that comes out of your mouth, if you say something that's kind of counterintuitive, Nietzsche would be a good example. God is dead. We already talked about that.
Right.
The moment you hear that, you think, tell me more, Nietzsche.
Right.
I didn't think he was dead. How can God be dead? It doesn't make any sense. And then you only know the rest of the story, which you do. A lot of people don't. But you only know the part about we killed him because you were interested enough to keep going.
Right.
So Nietzsche has accomplished his goal. And there's something we can learn from that.
Yeah, definitely. So the interesting thing, in the city, I saw the Titanic Broadway musical, and I still listen to the playlist on it from time to time on Spotify, because it's a great, I think it has great leadership lessons, right? Because the final analysis on the Titanic was that if they would have just built the bulkheads like 2 stories taller than they had, then the compartments wouldn't have filled up one by one and sunk the ship. So and ice is pretty tough.
Yes.
They thought that that the skin of the ship was tight enough, and it was not strong enough.
Right.
And they were going too fast, and they were ignoring things that they shouldn't have ignored. And there's a song near the end of the musical, where all of the players, the architect, the builder, the captain, they're all like, "You did it, you did it, you did it." They're pointing the fingers at each other.
Sure.
So
was there a rearranging the deck chair song?
no,
That's the expression you always hear.
Yeah,
There should have been.
yeah. It was. They didn't have enough boats either, because they thought it was unsinkable.
Right. Well, who needs boats?
Exactly, lifeboats. That is
right.
They actually did have enough. They just took them away because they wanted more space for people to
walk around.
And stuff.
So Paul said that they actually did have enough in the original design, but they didn't put them there because they wanted to have more room for people to walk around, which is probably true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Paradox. That's a good way. So you can use this from your marketing perspective, as a chief marketing officer. You can use this in campaigns. You can use this in regular communication with folks that you're dealing with.
Right.
Pretty much in every way.
Yeah, and I think so. I'll give you a corporate example, and I'll give you a personal brand example. So a corporate example would be where I'm at right now. So I work for this legal services company called Level Legal. And we're in a space that's called e-discovery and managed review. So e-discovery, as the name might imply, is, discovery is where you pull all these documents together that are related to a matter. Well, ever since we had electronic documents like PDFs and emails, well, that's become e-discovery. That those are the ways that those documents are held these days. In our space, it tends to be almost it's not at all viewed as being important. It's just a thing you have to do, almost a commodity, and not even a good one. It's just it's something you have to do to get it through. Well, at my company, we take what we think of as an enlightened view. We want to not just do the job, but we want to delight our customer. So the way that we use that in marketing is that we're selling to attorneys, right? Firms and in-house counsel. So we're saying, normally when you think of e-discovery managed review, it's a pain. It's something that is you're not going to get good customer service, but we're going to delight you. Even that's paradoxical. That it's the opposite of what you would expect for this particular space.
Mm-hmm.
So as a marketer, I think I'm all in. Let me at it. And the personal brand, you can see this even on my LinkedIn. What I've seen with marketers is that they tend to be either super creative Van Gogh type people, or they're super analytical Spock type people. And then I'm kind of, because of how I come out of this, I came out of journalism, so I've got this real creative angle.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, I've added a lot of analytics, because there's so much more now in marketing that you could do that is analytical in nature. The tools that you use to be able to tell what works and what doesn't work. There's this old joke from, now it's 100 years ago. Wanamaker, who had a series of retail stores in Philadelphia, said, I know that half of my marketing works, but I don't know which half. Well, that was 100 years ago. And then now we know, because of all of this technology,
able to track it.
Yeah, if you're on a site and you filled out a form, then they're aware of you.
Right.
So Mike clicked on this page and he's interested in this product because look, he downloaded this white paper. Yep. And that's not the same world. So for me, I'll say I'm a data-driven and analytical, or a data-driven and creative marketer. And for a lot of people that are hiring that, how can that be so? You have to be one or the other.
Right.
So it's paradox with your personal brand.
Very good. I like that. And it's pragmatic,
mm-hmm.
because you're not overly analytical and you're not overly creative.
Right. That can be taken to an extreme.
Right.
mm-hmm.
Very cool. Well, I read the background on In My Shoes when we started our conversation. I kind of want to end the conversation with that, because what I like in the marketplace of ideas, especially for not-for-profits, is those that think through the problem pragmatically and actually do something that can change a life directly. And I think In My Shoes does. My wife and I were both very moved by the individuals that came and shared. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about your involvement with In My Shoes, that 501c3 organization here in Dallas, and then perhaps how others that might be interested in supporting that organization could do so.
Yeah, absolutely. So a good way into it might be how I came to find out about it. So I still in good touch with my former boss from Interstate Batteries. Mm-hmm. And we were having coffee one time, just catching up. And she was talking to me about this nonprofit organization. She said, I want you to look at their brand, because that's something I really work on in everyday life. They could use some branding help, positioning, messaging, what have you. And I asked them, what kind of nonprofit are we talking about? And she said, well, this nonprofit is about, it's helping homeless pregnant women. Mm-hmm. And I was sold the moment she said that sentence, because I can't think of anybody that's more vulnerable than a homeless pregnant woman. Yeah. I mean, that is really tough situation to be in. Yeah. And I want to help when I hear something like that. And everybody I've ever talked to, as they hear that, and I want to help in some way to do that. And so, I followed through with that. And then eventually came on to the board. And, since I've been spending time, because I'll volunteer, that sort of thing, it's exactly what you're talking about. What's unique about it is it's the only maternity home in DFW where the staff live with the moms 24/7. Other situations, they'll have caseworkers that come in, and it's like in shifts. But this is all about a committed community of people.
More family oriented.
Right. Almost. And so it's the staff and and the moms and their babies, so we can have as many as 18 moms and 9 babies. We have a 3-to-1 ratio basically of staff to moms.
Right.
And said we want to focus a lot on that community, making it happen. And then the piece that I think is also important to know is that holistic perspective, because it is a faith-based organization. So there's the spiritual dimension that we believe that's hugely important to be able to change the way that you've lived. And on top of that, though, there are educational needs, financial needs. A lot of them are in this situation because of not really understanding how things could work better for them on both of those things. Substance abuse, a lot of time has played into this. And then, well, what are some emotional strategies that you could have that would keep you from turning to that, even in a difficult situation? Mm-hmm. And all of that's it's integrated In My Shoes. And so, and there are a lot of really good maternity homes in the United States, but then including in DFW. But it's that special model, I think, at In My Shoes that is compelling to me.
Yeah, I found it so as well. So you do fundraising all the time, but when is the next trivia night, and how does one get involved with that?
Sure. So our trivia night, we do fundraising all the time. So if you were to go to liveinmyshoes.org, the website, there are videos there that give you a look at what the house is like. There are interviews with moms, interviews with volunteers, interviews with donors, so you can kind of see how to plug this in. And then, but then you're right that the main way that we get funds is through trivia night. So what's trivia night? Well, I'm sure there are other ones, but I've been to a lot of fundraisers, but I haven't been to one that involves trivia, which is this competitive thing, which makes it a lot more fun to me than just going to a gala. I don't get to wear the tux very often, but I'd rather go to trivia night because it's interesting. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the cause is great. We do it once a year, usually in the spring. So it would be coming up, say, March of 2023 would be the next one. And we're already starting to talk about that. How can we take it, even in the next.
So are there table hosts, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's the model is that there are table hosts. So you'd buy a table, you invite your friends. If you don't get invited, that doesn't mean you can't come. Sure. There tends to be an overflow area that you could deal yourself into just by sending us an email. But and even at the event itself, there are a lot of different ways to give. We did a raffle that you can do. You can just become a monthly donor. That's easy to do when you're there. And then, of course, the website, anytime you wanted to either give or volunteers, we have volunteer needs to take care of the property where the moms and the babies live. There's a thing called house coverage, which is to spell that 24/7 staff so they can go and do things that they need to do, which is what I'm about to go do. Yeah. Right. And then you can cook meals for them. There are lots that you can bring, diapers. It's really, there's almost no way that you can't help. So I just encourage people to take a look.
Awesome. All right. Well, we've had a free-ranging conversation with lots of different topics. I really appreciate you coming out and spending this time with me. And I'd love to do it again sometime. So thanks very much for coming out. Is there any last thoughts that you have before we end the show?
Just one last thing, and that's because we've been looking through this plant this whole time that we've been here.
I didn't plan that, by the way. I moved the table up for our coffee, and then I didn't realize that the plant was so.
Well, there's a skit that Jack Galifianakis does that it's his own talk show called Between Two Ferns. And so I'll have two ferns on either side, and then chairs like ours.
The thing on the video you can't see that we're looking through it, but indeed this plant actually sticks out to about right here, so it's in our line of sight.
So we're not between two ferns, but we're separated by a plant.
Yeah, exactly.
That could be the name of the show.
So I'm going to go ahead and read the tickler that's coming out on the show. So follow Brad at linkedin.com/in/Bradley Cope. And then you can find more about In My Shoes at https://liveinmyshoes.org. And then, Paul, if you can run the short one for me. If you're interested in, go to the top. If you're the top one. If you're interested in learning more about growing the next version of you, online classes, go to www.leadershipin.thinkific.com. And you can follow me on LinkedIn as well. It's Mike Rochelle, MBA, and you can follow me there. So that, Brad, thank you very much for coming out today. I wish you well with In My Shoes, and I'll look forward to getting together at the next trivia night. So thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
It has been. It's been great.